Good morning. Eddie, I sure appreciate the work that you're doing, writing a new verse for us each one of these Sundays together. It's really a great blessing. One of the ways that we describe what we're about here is we're learning to live lives of love, and what we mean by that is what Jesus meant by that, is he taught us to love God with heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And so this life of love is multifaceted, and we are attempting to learn to live that life together. And if you're a guest with us here this morning, on site or online, we'd love for you to be part of that. There are a lot of ways in which we pursue that. One of the ways is through our gatherings. And so we have a gathering on Sunday mornings where we're working through what it means to experience God in the ordinary. We'd love for you to join us on Sundays at 10 o'clock in the morning, online or on site. Next Sunday, we take up drinking tea as a way of experiencing God. We also meet on Wednesdays, but as was mentioned earlier this morning, this week's our care group week, and our church is broken up into smaller groups, and we meet in those smaller groups every few months. This is one of those times we invite you to look in your inbox for an email from a church leader about details for your care group. Great opportunities to connect with each other and to live this life of love in a smaller group. Hope you'll turn to Psalm 130 if you haven't already, whether it's a physical Bible or a digital Bible, and keep that open as we walk our way through this psalm this morning. Elizabeth Day has made a living talking about failure. It seems like everybody fails. And as a journalist, she became intrigued about failure, especially the way that some of the most well-known people in their lives fail. And so she started a podcast, How to Fail with Elizabeth Day. And then she ended up writing a book, How to Fail by Elizabeth Day. She talked to people about their failures and how they dealt with failure, because it seems like everybody fails, and everybody's interested in learning how to handle failure in a better way. Our psalm this morning, Psalm 130, is all about failure. It's part of the Psalms of Ascents, these Psalms from 120 through 134, which Jewish pilgrims would sing as they were traveling to and from Jerusalem 3 times a year for their annual festivals. These Psalms remind us that our lives are a journey, and these are the songs that give us strength and encouragement for that journey. Psalm 130 reintroduces the conversation about failure. We also had part of this conversation with Psalm 123, which talked about shame. Shame is one of the unhealthiest responses that we can have to failure. And Psalm 130 takes up this conversation yet again. It reminds us that during our journey, we will experience failure. It's not a question of will we, but when will we? Every one of us is going to experience failure in our lives. And Psalm 130 is written to help us explore some of the best ways to handle that failure. Notice where our psalm begins this morning in verse 1. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. O Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my pleas for mercy. The failure to live up to standards, whether they're our own standards or the standards of the community in which we live or participate, especially failures that grow out of unhealthy choices that we make, out of selfish decisions that we make, that kind of failure is hard. And this psalm is not going to sugarcoat it for us. It's going to be honest about the way that we experience failure. And so the primary image the author uses here at the beginning is the image of being in the depths. Out of the depths, the author says, I cry out to you. We might imagine someone standing at the bottom of the ocean, overwhelmed by the wall of water and failure in which they are submerged. Or we might imagine someone at the bottom of a very deep pit, overwhelmed by the towering walls of dirt and failures surrounding them. To fail, whether it's in a relationship, whether it's at school, whether it's at work, whether it's at church, whether it's some other important area in our life, is hard. And we find ourselves in the depths. But notice what the author of this psalm does when he experiences the depths. Out of the depths I cry to you. Having failed, having in some way turned away from the Lord, this author now turns back to the Lord. He cries out to God in the midst of failure. And in so doing, this author demonstrates one of the healthiest responses to failure. A healthy response to failure is to turning away from God, is to turn back to God again and again. The psalm is reminding us that no matter how deep that pit is, how overwhelming that feeling is, failure is always an invitation to turn back to God. Brennan Manning, in his book, The Ragamuffin Gospel, writes this: "What makes authentic disciples is not visions, ecstasies, biblical mastery of chapter and verse, or spectacular success in the ministry, but a capacity for faithfulness. Buffeted by the fickle winds of failure, battered by their own unruly emotions, and bruised by rejection and ridicule, authentic disciples may have stumbled and frequently fallen, endured lapses and relapses, gotten handcuffed to the flesh pots, and wandered into a far country. Yet they kept coming back to Jesus." And ultimately, that's what a disciple is. That's what a follower of Jesus is. That's what it means to be a person of God. It doesn't mean that we never fail. It doesn't mean that we never find ourselves in the depths. It means that once there, having turned away from God, we turn back to God yet once again. From those depths, we cry out to God. But the question then becomes, what kind of God do we cry out to when we find ourselves in the depths of failure? And in this psalm, the author gives us two options for thinking about the kind of God that we might cry out to when we have failed. One kind of God is found in verse 3. "If you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who should stand?" The author is saying that sometimes when we find ourselves in the depths, experiencing failure, this is the kind of God that we think we're crying out to from those depths. A God who marks iniquities. And that language of marking iniquities is the language of watching and waiting. This is a God who is watching and waiting for you to fail. This is a God who's watching and waiting for you to make a misstep. And the author freely acknowledges that if that's the kind of God that you're praying to, when you fail, there's no standing that kind of God. You may as well just stay down there in the depths, because this kind of God is not going to be any kind of help when you failed. And so thankfully, the author of this psalm provides a different image for us to consider when we failed. Verse 4. "But with you there is forgiveness, that you may be feared." The author finally acknowledges that the God that we should cry out to when we failed is the God who always, always, always offers forgiveness. And so the psalm is challenging us to ask this question: when we fail, what is the gut response of God? When we fail, is God's gut response, his initial reaction, to say, "I knew it. I've been waiting for that to happen"? Is his initial reaction to say, "I'm so disappointed and I'm not very surprised"? Is his first reaction to say, "I can't wait to tell others about that"? No. God's gut reaction when we fail is forgiveness. His initial step is forgiveness. And as simple as that is, and as ho-hum as that might sound for those of us who have heard it 1,000 times before, it remains tremendously difficult for us to grasp. I was talking on Thursday with a fellow preacher. He and I have both preached a gospel of forgiveness at least for 20 years apiece. And yet he confessed that he struggles to apply that to himself. He confessed that he still generally rates his relationship with God based on how he's doing. And so if he's been kind and he's been good and he's been pure and he's been disciplined and he's been responsible and he's been hardworking and he's been selfless, then he is certain that God loves him. But when he fails, when he's selfish, when he's impure, when he's not disciplined and not hardworking, he is sure that God hates him. And he has never stood in a pulpit and preached that. But that is his experience of failure. And this psalm is begging us, it's urging us, it's imploring us to realize that that is not the God that we cry out to from the depths of failure. The God that we cry out to is a God whose gut reaction is always forgiveness. And here's the language that the psalmist uses to drive this home. I wait for the Lord. My soul waits, and in his word I hope. My soul waits for the Lord, more than watchmen for the morning, more than watchmen for the morning. This is a very important image being used here. We've seen this image before in the Psalms of Ascents. In general, it's the image of a very long night and the weariness that comes from that long night that is finally broken by the morning sunrise. The specific image here is a watchman. Again, we've seen this image in the Psalms of Ascent, someone who's standing on the tall wall surrounding the city, protecting and preserving the city. And that long night drags on. The darkness of the night feels like the depths of the ocean or the pit. The dangers of the night are real. And this watchman grows weary throughout the long night. And the watchman holds on to hope. The watchman is buoyed by the realization that eventually the sun will rise. And so the watchman waits in hope. It's a very appropriate image this time of year as we're moving towards the winter solstice and a long time of year when the night seems far too long and far too cold, and we weary of the darkness of the season. And yet we still know that every morning the sun will rise. And so we wait in hope. And the author of the psalm applies that image to failure to remind us that our second chance, our third chance, our fourth chance, our fifth chance, our thousandth chance with God is as certain as the sunrise. Any feeling of failure is not final. Any feeling of failure is not forever. The author is telling us that the sun of God's grace and mercy will always, always, always rise. And so we can wait in hope. We can wait in anticipation, knowing there's nothing that we can do to keep that sun from rising. There's nothing that anyone in our lives can do to keep that sun from rising. That sun doesn't rise because we're worthy. That sun rises because we are loved. There's nothing that we can do to cause it to rise. We can't go out and be good enough when we've been bad enough. We're simply called to wait in hope, knowing that the rising of the sun of God's grace and mercy is inevitable as the rising of our own sun every single morning. The sun will always rise on our failure. And the song reaches a crescendo in these final verses. O Israel, hope in the Lord. For with the Lord there is steadfast love, and with him is plentiful redemption, and he will redeem Israel from all his iniquities. Notice how the author now is just piling on phrase after phrase to help us feel this hope with the Lord. There's steadfast love. The Hebrew word here is chesed. It's that word used throughout the Old Testament, chesed. God is a God of steadfast love. It's one of the fundamental qualities of God. But not only that, with him there is plentiful redemption. The author is saying that grace and mercy and forgiveness is not in limited quantities when it comes to God. Last night we searched the town of Stamford for pumpkins. There were no pumpkins to be had anywhere in Stamford, just ugly little gourds. Pumpkins are apparently a limited quantity. But the redemption of God, the grace of God, the mercy of God is in unlimited quantities, the author wants us to know. It is plentiful. And then finally, he says that there is no iniquity outside of the reach of that sun. He will redeem Israel from all his iniquities. There is nothing that stands outside the light, the warmth, the hope of the Son of God's grace and mercy. But there is the challenge. There is the real rub of this psalm. Because what God is after in this psalm is not individuals who experience God's forgiveness. What God is after by the end of this psalm is an entire community of people experiencing God's forgiveness. Notice how the perspective of the psalm changes. It starts out with just an individual, one individual who's failed, one individual who's experienced the forgiveness of God. And by the end of the psalm, the camera pans out until we see many individuals. We see all of Israel. We see all of the people of God. And one thing that we note about them all is that every single one of them in that community has experienced what that individual has experienced. They've all been, they all are, they are all going to be people who've experienced failure. This community is a community of failure. And God's hope for it is that it will also be a community of forgiveness. What God envisions here at the end of the psalm is an entire community where forgiveness flows freely, where there are plentiful resources for forgiveness, where forgiveness is experienced and expressed by all within the community. And there is the rub. Because that can only happen when we express forgiveness. So many people will never experience the forgiveness of God until they experience the forgiveness of the people of God. This psalm and its final verse can't become a reality until we extend what's been extended to us. And so often in our fractured world, there are many people who are willing to embrace faith as a way to be forgiven, but there are very few willing to embrace faith as a way to be forgiving. And this is a challenge of Paul in the letter to Colossians, chapter 3, verse 13. As the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. There are too many times when the community of God is known as a community that cancels those who fail, as a community who cuts off those who fail, as a community who curses those who fail. But the challenge of this psalm is that we would be the community where forgiveness is always known. Brian Zahnd, in his book Radical Forgiveness, writes story after story about what this looks like, especially historically. He shares the story of the Armenian genocide of 1915 to 1917, when 1.5 million Armenians were murdered by Ottoman Turks and millions more were brutalized and deported. The story flows out of that time period of a Turkish officer who leads soldiers in an attack on an Armenian home. The parents of the home are killed, the children are brutalized. The oldest child escapes, manages to survive. She goes on to become a nurse, and early in her training, she's in a ward filled with wounded Turkish officers and soldiers. And there in the ward is the officer who led the attack against her family's home. She could do nothing and allow him to die. She could do something and save his life. And she chooses the latter. And when the officer comes around and sees her, he asks her, "Do I know you?" And she simply says, "Yes." And after a long moment, he realizes why he knows her. And he asks her, "Why did you save my life?" And she responds simply, "Because I am a follower of the one who taught us to love our enemies." And ultimately, that is the direction in which this psalm points. It's calling for us to be the community where the inevitable forgiveness of God rises upon all whom we meet. It's calling us to be that community where forgiveness flows, is plentiful, and is new every single morning. Perhaps this morning, through something that you've heard from this text or others who've been here, the songs that we've sung, something is stirred within you. Perhaps you came into this space online or on site, and something stirring within you because of events in your life. We'd love to talk with you about that. I hope you'll grab any of us who've been up here at the front, any of our staff and elders after the service is over. We'd be glad to speak with you after the service. Right now, we want to spend just a few seconds in meditation, and then Eddie and our host will close the service out. But for right now, I invite you to take a few seconds and to consider these questions. In what ways do I need to experience being forgiven? And in what ways do I need to express being forgiving?